Okay, so we're going to start first of all with our first speaker, Stevie Rice. Stevie is the Chief Executive of West Kent Mind, and she's going to be talking to us about the importance of connecting with nature. Stevie.
Evening, everybody. Sorry, just getting my technical stuff sorted out this side. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here this evening, and it's lovely to be able to talk to you about something that's incredibly passionate, that I'm passionate about and is close to my heart. So as Teresa said, I'm Stevie. I'm the Chief Executive of West Kent Mind, and just to tell you a little bit about who we are and what we do. Okay, you'll have to forgive me, the slides aren't going forward. Just bear with me one moment. Okay, that's sorted. Sorry about that. So who we are and what we do. So West Kent Mind is a mental health charity. We're affiliated to Mind, and we work across Tunbridge and Malling Borough, across Sevenoaks District and across Tunbridge Wells Borough. And our vision is to enrich people's lives through better mental well-being, and we do that by offering support to get well, stay well, and to thrive. So Get Well provides the therapeutic interventions for and with people when they become unwell or if they need additional support. Stay Well provides them with the tools to manage their mental health on an ongoing basis and ensuring that people have the tools in place to protect their mental health. And Thrive creates this framework in which people can use their mental health experience to thrive with knowledge, with understanding, with awareness, and with this really, I guess, a really positive approach to mental health for themselves, but also for others. So this is just a little bit of a snapshot of some of the things that we've been doing. We run training in mental health awareness. We run training in suicide awareness and prevention for young people. We deliver a whole counselling programme. We have a crisis intervention service. We support people who are bereaved or are facing loss of some kind. We have a mum support group, an autism support group, and we run a really comprehensive social activity programme for people if they want to come together and connect on a weekly basis for social interaction and just to provide that kind of structure to a week. But that's not going to answer some of the big questions that we've all got tonight. You know, there's big questions about nature and the environment. So why are we drawn to the natural environment? Why do we enjoy brilliantly coloured sunsets, for example? Why do we feel such joy at the sight of a rainbow? And why do we come together to appreciate phenomena like eclipses? Why is the natural environment important to the human condition, and what impact does nature have upon health and well-being? So these are all really big questions, and these are questions that scientists are busy exploring right now, and they're busy researching this stuff. And there's definitely a lot of evidence that's emerging over the past few years and now about this profound link that seems to exist between mental health, physical health, and nature. It's not exactly clear why being outdoors has such a positive mental effect, but there's no doubt that nature seems to have this really profound effect on us, you know, impacting us in a whole load of different ways. We're animals that started existing in the same way that every other being did in a natural ecosystem. And I guess it's easy for us all to forget because we like to think of civilization as being somewhat removed from every other natural thing that exists. But that's not true. Our origins completely belie what we truly are. We are beings of nature. And it's only been in the last several thousand years that humans have developed techniques that have almost kind of secluded us from those natural surroundings. So if our human history was encapsulated into a 24-hour clock, and let's say hunter-gatherers, I mean, were on the earth 100, 200,000 years ago, let's say 100,000 years ago, that would only have been 24 hours ago. Agriculture only started emerging 2.5 hours ago. First cities were developed and started growing and building an hour ago. Industrial Revolution only happened 2.5 minutes ago. And then the digital revolution, digital technology, 20 seconds ago. So you can see our bodies have not had time to adapt. We're essentially living in a very hostile environment, which causes our bodies stress. And staying close to nature improves that physical, that mental, and that spiritual well-being that we all know about. It makes us feel alive from the inside. And perhaps we shouldn't be so surprised. I don't know why we are, but we've compromised this in some way for recent developments like urbanization, like technology, like social media, being on screens all the time. But stress is your body's way of responding to any kind of demand or threat. And when you sense danger, whether it's real or whether it's imagined, it could be both, the body's defenses just kick into this high gear in a rapid kind of automatic process known as the fight or flight reaction, or sometimes called the stress response. And that stress response is the body's way of protecting you, and it helps us to respond quickly to dangerous situations. And sometimes this stress response can be an appropriate or beneficial reaction. For example, when you're about to give a presentation to some gorgeous people. But if our stress response is activated repeatedly, again and again and again, the effects can result in wear and tear on the body. And that can cause us to feel permanently in a state of fight and flight. And that kind of pressure can make us feel completely overwhelmed or unable to cope. And it can impact on both physical and mental health. So sources of stress can be anywhere. And I think, you know, in some respects, we've almost kind of grown used to this stress around us. Stress could be traffic, could be sitting in traffic, it could be the noise of traffic, it could be contending with traffic as a pedestrian, as a driver, as a cyclist. It could be workplace noise, and sounds of overhead lights buzzing, servers droning, phones ringing, colleagues talking, drumming fingers, gosh, isn't that most annoying? Fire alarm tests, emails pinging in. It could be home noise, and we forget about this, but the TV on, the fridge, hairdryers, social media, smartphone alerts, notifications, kettles, washing machines, dishwashers, you know, all of that kind of stuff. And the drone of aeroplanes going overhead. Wherever you seem to be in Kent, you hear those aeroplanes, although not so much now, actually, not so much in the last 12 months, funnily enough. But you start to kind of not notice all this stuff. You start to not notice it, but that doesn't mean your body or your mind has stopped noticing it. It's just that you're not consciously aware of it. So before working at West Kent Mind, I was the Director of Engagement at Kent Wildlife Trust. And a big hello to my Kent Wildlife Trust friends who are out there. I know you're there, Jenny. And I did a lot of work when I worked at Kent Wildlife Trust on nature and wellbeing. I worked with an artist called Mark Ware on a project that was all about understanding how natural sounds impacted on mental health. Now, he recorded sound effects in both natural and artificial environments to better understand our kind of neurological response to these different sounds. So he recorded sounds like running water, lapping water, you know, on the beach, you know, the breeze through woodland, breeze through rushes, but then he also recorded fridges and aeroplanes and hairdryers and things like that. Now, he worked with the Brighton and Sussex Medical School and to analyse the sounds and the brain and the body responses to each of them. And researchers found that playing the natural sounds affected the bodily systems that control flight or fight. Now, we know that natural sounds in green environments have been linked with promoting relaxation and well-being, but until now, there's been no scientific consensus as to how these effects come about. So through this research, we discovered that when listening to natural sounds, the brain connectivity reflected this outward, this kind of directed focus of attention. So when listening to artificial sounds, the brain connectivity reflected an inward directed focus of attention. So, and that inward focused direction of attention is very similar to the states that we see in anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, and depression. So these volunteers were asked to conduct tasks, and when the volunteers were listening to the natural sounds, the brain reflected this monitoring of the external environment, and there was this improvement in their task performance when they were listening to natural sounds. But when they were listening to the artificial sounds, there was this increased connection with a part of the brain that's involved in what's known as self-referential thought processing. And when they went into this self-referential thought processing, their task performance was impaired. Now, this high levels of self-referential thoughts are definitely associated with anxiety and with other mood disorders. But this investigation suggests that maybe this exposure to natural sounds, it could be beneficial to mental health. So by reducing the likelihood of self-referential thoughts, that would improve well-being and improve mental health. Now, I have to say, just a caveat here, that the researchers have emphasised that the work is exploratory, it is still ongoing, and that further experiments would be required to substantiate and strengthen those claims. But very interesting project to begin with, and I was pleased to be a part of that. There's been a number of other interesting experiments in recent years linking nature and mental health. And one particular experiment, which was conducted in Japan, participants were assigned to either walk in a forest or in an urban centre, and they had to take walks of equal length and equal difficulty whilst they were having their heart rate and their blood pressure measured. And they also filled out questionnaires about their moods and about stress and stuff. Now, these results showed that those who walked in forests had significantly lower heart rates and reported better moods and less anxiety than those who walked in urban settings. So there was this conclusion by the researchers that there's definitely something about being in nature that has a beneficial effect on stress reduction. And that's above and beyond what kind of exercise alone might have produced. Another interesting one, and one that I'm really fascinated by, is psychologists from the University of Utah and the University of Kansas conducted an experiment in which they sent backpackers out into the wilderness for 4 days, completely disconnected from their electronic devices. Now, these backpackers did a test beforehand, but when they came back, they did the same test and they scored 50% better on a creativity test after the 4 days. So being out in nature seemed to enhance their creative problem solving, their insight, their imagination, their propensity for adaptation, for curiosity and divergent thinking. So that kind of being in nature provides our mind with a place to rest, you know, not away from that kind of fight or flight sort of syndrome. It gives us a place to relax and let down our threat responses. And I guess this provides us with opportunities to be creative, to problem solve and to be imaginative. And one other, example, an interesting series of experiments that was published in 2014 by the University of California. They were researching the potential impact of nature on the willingness to be generous, trusting and helpful towards others. And as part of their study, the researchers exposed participants to beautiful nature scenes and then observed how those participants behaved when they were playing 2 economics games. And these economics games were set up specifically to measure generosity and trust. And after being exposed to the more beautiful nature scenes, participants acted apparently more generously and more trusting in the games than those who saw less beautiful scenes. So if you want to improve your kindness towards folk, get out there in nature. It seems to work. So despite the abundance of nature and the natural world, mental health is declining. And I think we all know that. We have become detached from nature for all sorts of reasons. Urban living, the ease of access to retail, to health, to education, to centres of prosperity, to be closer to employment, to be closer to family and friends. We congregate in specific urban spaces. But also the lack of access to green space, that fear of, am I allowed to go there? Should I be there? What happens if I go off the path? Should I do this? Should I not do it? And that physical access to local green space can be a problem for many people, and as can the confidence to go out there. Working patterns. Most of the working day is spent in places that aren't really easily accessible to nature. You might work in warehouses or offices, and these are places that probably have not been designed with well-being and nature in mind. And I guess also the rise of the digital age means that, we do much more of our work, our working hours indoors now. We're not working so much on the land or, are doing outdoor work. We're indoors and we're much more sedentary. Also, I think it's fair to say that there is less space now available for outdoor recreation. And I think we saw, a few years back, the selling off of spaces, education, green spaces in schools and stuff, which was a real travesty. So I'm just going to scar your eyes with an image like this. If we compare this image, which is obviously a much more extreme version of what we're all potentially used to, it's really hard to get that sense of a strong sense of where we are, you know, that kind of perspective, distance, shape, form, temperature, smell, sound. Everything's designed to be competitive, to grab your attention in more garish, bold, arresting ways. So you compare that with this. I mean, just this, I mean, obviously it's a beautiful image. This is a beautiful photograph by Paul Sanders, but it's so much more appealing. And I have this theory, and there's no science attached to this, but I have this theory that in nature, you know, the colours don't really jar. The light does something to the hues that makes colours just work together in a way that doesn't happen with artificial light. And just incidentally, Paul is, he used to be the picture editor for the Times, the photographer here. He's running My Mind's Eye, which is a mindful photography programme at West Kent Mind, which is actually having some really startling impacts on people's mental health at the moment. So just to give a little plug to that. So I think what we see and what we hear and what we feel and what we taste is all congruent with our experience when we're out in nature. You know, we see waves, we taste salt, we feel the breeze, we hear the seagulls. It all kind of feels right. But when we're indoors, we hear sounds that we can't naturally determine, you know, the hum of the fridge. We see a cup of coffee, but we're smelling Glade air freshener. We feel hot, yet we see snow outside. We're kind of, I think, out of kilter with reality, and our senses are completely competing with one another. And I also have this theory, again, not scientific, don't quote me on this, it's just a personal feeling, that when you're out in nature, there is something about the rhythms of nature that kind of slow your breathing. And particularly when you're out on a beach and, you know, the waves come in, the waves go out, you know, I just feel that there is a certain rhythm there that kind of regulates your breathing in a way that induces a much more relaxed kind of state of being. So just the immersion in nature and its balancing harmony can have this significant impact on our bodies. And nature has the power to regulate our hormones, from the stress hormone cortisol to the hormones that control our circadian rhythms. There just seems to be so many benefits of immersing yourself in nature. Being outdoors appears to be one of the greatest medications. So just to contextualise where we are now in the world, sorry to bring you all back down to earth, but obviously, you know, we've been in the middle of a pandemic. Mind conducted some research during the pandemic, and those people that were most impacted in terms of poor mental health were women, most impacted, disabled people, those living in social housing, people with pre-existing mental health conditions, frontline workers, and people from Black and Asian and minority ethnic communities. Now, the news stories are everywhere about the prevalence of poor mental health as a result of the pandemic and the restrictions, not just the pandemic. But given that COVID has had this detrimental impact on our mental health, what can we do about it? Well, if you were to get outdoors, because we've just talked about how incredible nature is for you, if you were to do it with others, because being with other people is also great for your mental health and well-being, and you were being active, which we all know improves health and well-being anyway, and if you were doing that whilst you were giving something back to the community, which, by the way, has also been proven to be good for you, you're in danger of supercharging that dose of nature to the point of becoming superhuman. That's, again, not scientific, but you get my drift. So Mind has all sorts of activities on their site about how to get out and enjoy nature, or how to bring nature into your own home. So you can go stargazing, you can go picnicking, beachcombing, exercising outdoors, gardening, growing, geocaching, rambling, painting, or you can do stuff within your local churchyard. And I think one of the exciting things that I've been looking at over the last couple of years really is where people create spaces for wildlife, for community growing. And there have been churchyards, delivering some really fantastic projects up and down the country, which have turned aspects of their graveyards into allotment space, edible hedges, wildlife spaces, fruit and vegetable beds. And these are things that have brought the community together. And there have been real positive impacts as a result of doing that. So this week, we want everyone across Kent, West Kent, and across the country, wherever you are, to notice nature and to try to make a habit of connecting to nature every day. I just stop to listen to the bird song and smell the freshly cut grass and take care of a house plant, or just notice any trees or any animals or wildlife or flowers that might be nearby. I mean, that moment to just appreciate these connections and I think not just appreciate them, but how does it make you feel? Just take a moment to celebrate nature in your daily life. Now, I'm incredibly lucky, you know, I go out 2 or 3 times a day, have a little dog, so you know, you have to get out. But I was walking in a field, and it was beautiful weather, a beautiful field with a beautiful dog. I may not have mentioned him before. He normally gets a shout out in my presentations. Jenny will know that. So I was in this field, and in my head I was composing this email for work. I was writing it, and I was so focused on that, missing everything that was around me. I mean, you know, here I was taking a break but couldn't switch off. But thankfully I did check myself and stood up straight and just thought, oh, get a grip, Stevie, and began to notice what was around me. So anyway, back to Mental Health Awareness Week. So take a photo, video, or a sound recording, share the connections you've made during the week to inspire others. Join the discussion on how you're connecting with nature by tagging @WestKentMind and using the various hashtags Connect with Nature and Mental Health Awareness Week. But we want to talk openly and honestly about mental health, and we also want to connect with nature to support mental health, and that's really important. And I'm just going to finish with a little story that I kind of was really important to me at the time. You know, it was a couple of years ago, and I'd had a really difficult day at work, very, very stressful for whatever reason. Didn't have any food in the house, so I had to stop off at the shop on the way home. Picked up the shopping, got home in a bad mood, opened the door and shouted to my partner Jason to come and help me because the shopping had all fallen out of the bags as I stumbled through the front door. So I shouted him again, he didn't come, didn't answer. Eventually I pick up all the baked beans and the bread and the milk and everything else that had fallen out of the bag, and I walk into the kitchen feeling even more peeved that he hadn't come to my rescue at the front door, feeling more stressed about it. And there he was with his nose pressed to the back window, and he was looking intently. And I said, well, did you not hear me? Did you not hear me shouting, Jason? And he just turned around to me and he said, shh. He said, fly footprints. So what I ask of you is just to be curious, catch sight of the beautiful, remark on the unusual, notice the changing seasons, savor the moment, be aware, and reflect on your experience. I just end with one final quote, you know, that I think is lovely, that really helps us to understand how nature can help us.
Thank you very much indeed, Stevie. That was exactly on time, absolutely fantastic, and an excellent presentation. Really fascinating research that you've actually sort of highlighted there, and fantastic, all those thoughts on the benefits of nature. What we're going to do is go straight into our second speaker, to Caroline, Dr. Caroline Jessel. Caroline is a former GP and chair of the Kent Nature Partnership. And Caroline is going to cover some more of the sort of medical side of things. Caroline.
Hello, thank you very much, Teresa. And I hope you can all see my slides and hear what I'm saying, all right? Delighted to be with you, and I've really enjoyed Stevie's slides. I can't promise mine are going to be so beautiful, but I can say that a lot of what I'm going to talk about echoes what she's been saying. So we're in harmony tonight. I have a medical background. I've been a GP for 30 years in Kent, and I got frustrated really with the medical model for helping people with mental health, and explored much more how we can do things a bit differently. So that's what I'm going to talk about. So my main message to you tonight is that we're all part of nature, and nature needs us. And for context, and do forgive me if I repeat some of the things that Stevie said, because she's put them very elegantly in a different order to mine, but they are quite similar points. We are in the midst of a global health pandemic, which has had massive impacts on our mental health. But actually before that, the statistics were going in the wrong direction with mental health. It's been getting worse for many decades now, and that's been a great concern if you're a GP, because physical health has undoubtedly improved on every measure, but mental health has deteriorated. We have a nature crisis as well. A lot of species under threat of extinction. We're in the 6th mass extinction. We have a climate crisis, as everybody I'm sure is aware, and we have a potential economic crisis. So I really want to point out, with systemic problems, these are all, there may be, when I was a young GP, I was always taught if a patient comes in with 5 or 6 problems, they've probably just got 1 problem or maybe 2, and they're causing all the others. And we've got a lot of problems in our society. I'd like to propose that nature disconnection is one of the significant underlying factors that we need to correct. And we sort of all know this, and we've all known this for many years. Hippocrates was in the 2nd century BC and saying nature itself is the best physician. So we know that nature is important for our health and well-being. It's also the basis of our wealth as a society, and we can't survive without healthy soils, clean air, clean water, biodiversity, access to green space, and all the other ecosystem services that nature kindly provides for us free of charge. I suppose we're very, very fortunate in that way. And where do we go wrong in this sort of divorce from nature, if you like, or distancing from nature? And part of it, I think, was back in the time of René Descartes in the 16th century, where the idea of a split between the mind and body came about. And this is very much underpins Western thinking, not so much in the East of the world. But I think the mind-body split led to a lot of other splits. So humans being not an animal, being different to the rest of the natural world as a split, and a lot of medical splitting into specialities, which meant that we weren't seeing the whole picture in terms of people's health. And I like this slide because it just summarizes some of the things Stevie was pointing out. Our divorce from the natural environment has been a fairly recent thing in our evolution. For many millennia, we evolved in nature. Now we often live in cities or places that are very alien to nature, and we try and drive it out of our homes and our world, and people are frightened of insects and so on. There's a lot of fear, there's a lot of distrust, and we spend a lot of time surrounded by electronic devices. But this is very recent, as Stevie graphically showed in her presentation. So a few thoughts of mine about nature and mental health. It is, in fact, the single largest cause of disability in Kent, mental health, and it is one of the most major source of workplace absence. So it has a massive impact economically and on people's lives and livelihoods. We know that inequalities and economic vulnerabilities make mental health worse, and some of the stark differences have been exposed by the COVID pandemic, but they were there before. Health inequalities have been a big worry in the NHS for many decades. We also know that loneliness is a risk factor for mental health, and loneliness has been on the rise. Lack of meaning and purpose is very important for our mental health, and a lot of people experience that. And I think, from the point of view of your pastoral care, you'll be very, very much aware of this. I think the work that we do now often lacks meaning and purpose. It's often repetitive and been itemized so much into little pieces that people can't see the bigger picture always of what they're doing. There's this thing which we now call ecological grief or solastalgia, which is sadness for the world that we are in the process of destroying. And this psychiatrists are recognizing this as a profound factor in increasing mental health problems, especially among young people. And psychiatrists are shifting their approach more into that of creating resilient communities that support each other. And we know this has a great impact on mental health and shifting whole populations into feeling happier. And this can be done by access to nature. So what exactly is happening? Stevie gave some very good accounts of the science regarding mental health and nature, and we're beginning to understand a lot more. The University of Derby with Miles Richardson have done a huge amount of work on this. And we know that if you feel part of nature, that correlates with life satisfaction, vitality, meaningfulness, happiness, mindfulness, and all these wonderful things, lower anxiety, which all correlate with good mental well-being. They also impacts on the body, blood pressure, stress, respiratory tract illnesses, cardiovascular illnesses, and improving mental fatigue. And in fact, there are no conditions other than hay fever and a few things that are not made better by reconnecting with nature. That applies at any age and for any condition almost. And when we talk about nature connection, there is a spiritual element to this. It's not so much just being in a nice place and looking around, but it's understanding and engaging with the beauty of that place, having direct contact through your senses, smell, sight and sound and touch, plus understanding the emotion in that connection, the compassion, the meaning. That's all part of connection. So you can actually be, for example, a farm worker in a tractor with headphones on, with nature all around you, but no sense of connection. You can be totally disconnected from it and at the same time be destructive to it with being surrounded. So it's not just about being there, it's about connecting and the emotion involved with that. So science is catching up with all of this, as Stevie's also said. So we know about phytoncides, for example, which are emitted in woodlands from trees, and why woodland, in fact, is better for your well-being than just being out in another green space. And also the sea creates similar chemicals which make you feel better. So the sea or water is better than just a normal, say, a lawn or a golf course, for example. Now, there is this theory of the green mind from the University of Essex, Professor Jules Pretty, and Stevie talked a little bit about the sympathetic nervous system, the fight and flight part of your brain and body. What the green mind is about is getting your balance right between the parasympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic one. So the parasympathetic one slows your breathing, reduces your heart rate, and calms your mind. And nature does all that. It helps that balance. It also helps your T-cell immunity, which is your response from your immune system to conditions you've not met before. So very useful in a pandemic. That's boosted a lot with nature. Your vitamin D synthesis with sunlight. Get out in the middle of the day if you can. We know a lot more about how trauma impacts on the brain, and nature heals that impact, partly through stimulating the senses, which have been atrophied by trauma. This can all be shown on MRI, functional MRI scanning, which we now have, so we can watch the impact on the brain. We know in therapeutic terms about neurosequencing, stimulating the more basal parts of the brain, the more primitive parts, through things like rhythm, dance, music, smell. And doing that first helps the trauma heal. And we're also beginning to understand the very complex gut microbiome and the mycelium. So we're also beginning to advertise things using this knowledge. So a wooden house can protect you from coronavirus, for example. And I'm showing this slide not for you to read it all. It's very complicated and we haven't got much time. And it's simply to illustrate the complexity of our relationship with the living world. And this is about plants and soil biology and food and human beings. And it's very complex, but I'd be willing to bet that in 20 years' time, you could add another 50 or 60 things to that slide. We're learning all the time, and we realize it's not a simple matter of eating more greens. The relationship of the soil and health and well-being, mental health as well as physical, is very important and very complicated. Now, we've known for some time about the attention restoration theory, and Stevie touched on it in her talk. The key point here is that nature helps us do this involuntary attention, which replenishes our mental fatigue. So we're not always having to be concentrating hard, looking at screens and so on. We need this free-floating type of attention, which reduces our stress levels. This is an example very similar to the Japanese study that Stevie showed, but showing a different set of people in Essex, in fact. Mental health patients going for a walk, same distance. If they're in the shopping centre, they don't feel any better about themselves. They feel worse, even though they've had the same level of exercise. That's maybe because they're seeing all this stuff they can't afford to buy. But the people out in nature, they feel better. It's the same group of people, same amount of walking. So this illustrates the point. I like this slide. It's quite complicated, but basically the point it shows is it doesn't really matter. And William Bird, by the way, Dr. William Bird, I'm grateful to him from Intelligent Health for this slide. What it basically shows is that if you are, there's a gap in income between the richest and the poorest. If they're in an environment with very little green space, that gap is much bigger in terms of health outcomes than if they're in an environment with a lot of green space that they can access. The gap, so health inequalities can be reduced by just allowing people proper access to green space. I personally think it's your birthright. Every child should have access to a garden or somewhere to play in a green space. So how can we change our system that we've designed badly for human health and well-being, even though we've done some things well? How can we get our dose of nature? Well, there's a lot of stuff called green prescribing now in Kent. And you may have heard of some of these organizations. I'm going to talk a little bit about the one I started, Dandelion Time. But the point I want to make here is these various organizations do different types of ecotherapy, help people get back on track, often with mental health challenges, but also with their physical health challenges. It works just as well for both. There is now a group of a sort of alliance of professionals getting together to make this prescribing available to people on a much more organized and systematic way. So that's great news. The one I started back in 2001, really, we started, was Dandelion Time. And that's for children who've experienced trauma and abuse. And using nature, because I got really frustrated at the long waiting list for CAMS and the fact that children came back from CAMS saying they didn't want to go again. They didn't want to see a psychiatrist, they didn't want drugs. And what could you offer something different? So I will just give you a little bit of a flavor about what we do at Dandelion Time with these slides. We work with the whole family and we try and break the cycle of abuse and make long-lasting changes. So very different to a sort of drug-based approach. And self-esteem, self-worth, trust, those are really important things, which, as Stevie illustrated, benefit from exposure to nature. We have extremely good outcomes. I won't go into a lot of detail on this, but this will give you an idea that we work in nature, but we also use the hands a lot, do craft work. That's shown to be very important for your brain and your parasympathetic nervous system, which we need to stimulate. So what is the magic in an organization like Dandelion Time? We engage the hands, the head, and the heart, all three very important. The connection with other species and the dynamic whole of nature helps children to redefine themselves and realize their place in the world more easily, and to understand vulnerability and how nurture is so important. And the fact that we're all part of a much bigger whole, something that I'm sure many members of this audience are very, very conscious of. And just to wrap up with a few reading tips, both Isabel Hardman and Emma Mitchell, who wrote these books, have experienced extreme mental health difficulties and found nature was an enormous part of their survival and recovery mechanism. And Patrick Barkham explores very much the impact of children on nature, which is very interesting because trauma in childhood has far worse outcomes than trauma in adulthood because brains are still developing. So it's really a critical time to intervene and help and support and turn around the situation. So at that point, I will just reiterate my initial point. We all need nature and nature needs us, and throw it open back to Teresa for questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Caroline. That was extremely stimulating and as with Stevie's presentation, fascinating. I've learned a lot if no one else has, so that was wonderful. We've had a few questions come up in the chat. Thank you for putting your questions in the chat. Do continue with them. But at the moment there are 3 to pick up on in particular. The first 2 came through in Stevie's presentation. So if I just ask those, Stevie, and perhaps you can answer, I'll ask them one at a time. So the first one was, when assessing response to artificial sounds, did that include music? Also, can sound recording of nature replicate the positive effects of being outside?
That's a really interesting question, and actually it was music that was the starting point for this piece of work. Actually, Mark Ware, as the artist, was working with a group of disabled people, and there was a young woman who had cerebral palsy, but she couldn't speak, and she was very much, very tightly furled up in her wheelchair, and he was playing her an aria. I think it was a Mozart aria, and she was becoming more and more agitated. And interestingly, her support worker said, I think you need to stop. I don't think she likes it. And so we stopped playing that, and Mark started playing her the waves. And gradually this young woman's hands started to unfurl. She started to physically unwind and relax in front of Mark. And this was the moment in which he conceived the idea. So I don't know whether, the difference between nature sounds and music, whether there'd be a very different response. And I suspect there's a whole lot of, research done in and around music and the response to music, and depends on what that kind of music is. But in terms of whether recorded nature sounds or natural sounds, I think there is the same impact, really. I don't know if you're aware, but there are so many apps out there with nature sounds on it. And I have to say, my phone is riddled with them. I have so many of them on there, and I'd spend most nights going to sleep listening to nature sounds or listening to calm meditations with nature sounds in the background. So I think there's definitely benefits from listening to those sounds, even if they are recorded.
Excellent, thank you very much. Another question. I'm conscious that some people may be struggling to get outside because of fear and the habits that have been formed through lockdown. How do we help people to reclaim the space of being outside their front doors?
Oh, such a pertinent question. And I think that's really one of the beauties about nature, is that there has been lots of evidence to show that even just looking out of your window can have beneficial impacts. Looking out at nature, even just looking at a picture of nature, listening to recorded sounds of nature, nurturing a pot plant inside your home can have beneficial impacts. So I think there's definitely, small steps that one can take before venturing out. But we're all feeling a little bit apprehensive about re-entering society. I know I am. Haven't been out connecting with people in a proper kind of way, face to face for a long time, like many of us have. So I think it's small steps at a time, and if the first thing that you're doing is being out in the garden or taking a walk to the end of the road, I think that's fine. Caroline, I wonder whether you've got anything to add on that.
Oh, thank you. Yes, I mean, I think this is a lot of people are saying this, and I've done several of these talks this week, and this has come up in all of them. I think it is very hard because your home is your sort of security blanket, really, and we've all retired and retreated into our homes, and it is easy to get slightly phobic about the outside world with this pandemic, going on. But I would echo the small steps and bringing nature into your home. Elizabeth Mitchell's book's very good on that, actually, and bringing in a leaf and drawing it, for example, which is easy to do because a leaf might blow in through your front door even, and things like that. It's and then small steps and going with someone else as well. Social support can be very helpful for the confidence building again, and that is more allowable now. But it's like any other phobia. You have to confront it, but you mustn't over confront it, or you'll go back, you'll reverse. So you've got to do it in gradual steps, stretching yourself a little bit more every time.
Okay, thank you both, Stevie and Caroline. Sorry, there was a pause because I'm sort of keeping an eye on the chat myself as well. Right, okay, I'm going to carry on with the next question that actually came through during Caroline's talk. And this was: standing on the seashore, watching the sea lapping on the beach helps me to cope with looking after my depressive husband and aids my praying. How can I keep this state when my caring is so difficult?
Well, that's a very heart-wrenching question. And I think all of our hearts go out to you in that situation. I think that, if you can, perhaps you might want to elaborate a bit more, but if you can't, and it's something you need to talk through with somebody a bit. But if you can keep that connection with the seashore regularly, you need time. I've always said that anyone who's a carer needs to care for themselves just as much as the person they're caring for, because if you don't look after yourself, you are no use to anybody else, really. If you collapse, then what? So number one priority for everybody's day is to make a little bit of space for the thing that helps you. And if you know that the seashore and those sounds, which I also find really powerful, and I think we all do, why do people go to the seaside for their holidays? It's a very powerful experience, and very important experience. If that's good for you, you must make time and space for that, and try to keep going as much as you can and get the support that you need to do this very challenging job. There are people out there who can help.
Thank you, Caroline. I was just wondering, just picking up on at that point, and just thinking about some of the points that were raised in the talks. Perhaps having pictures of the seashore, if you've got a picture on the wall, or perhaps if we've got some of these apps, or we can have a recording of the seashore, just playing that from time to time can just perhaps help with our connection and just act as that reminder.
Or a large shell, because I was used to love as a child putting a shell to my ear and hearing the sea, as they always said. But that there's a tactile. The senses are more than sight and sound. We live a lot of our time in sight and sound with screens and headphones, etc. But touch, smell, emotion, feeling, they're all important senses. So if you can have things that remind you, if you can't get there, then I think really important. And growing stuff indoors is also good if you can't get out. So just a little seed tray with a few little seeds can make a big difference to how you feel when they pop up.
Thank you, Caroline. They're not, I think those are all of the questions that we've had. We've had another point made. Someone says, I also recommend a book, Losing Eden by Lucy Jones. Don't know if anyone has any further recommendations, but it's just thinking about being interested in creativity, nature and well-being. What I'm thinking about is if we do end up with a book list, maybe we could post this on the diocesan website along with the webinar. It just gives some pointers for people if they'd like a book list.
Yeah, I just thought of one that I've recently read that I do strongly recommend if anyone's interested in mental health and nature, but also the system that we kind of work and live in. It's by Horatio Clare, and it's called Heavy Light. And he suffers from bipolar disorder and had a recent psychotic illness, was admitted to a mental health hospital. And he really describes it very, very well, both the whole experience, what the impact on his family, and the things that really helped him to recover, which included his strong connection with nature. But it also shone a spotlight on our really very inadequate mental health system, which made me feel slightly appalled and ashamed as a doctor. So worth reading, I'd say.
Thank you, thank you. I've got some more things coming in here. The Arthur Rank Centre have a booklet, Rural Isolation and Loneliness, a toolkit for rural churches. And can people self-refer to charities like Dandelion Time, or do they need to go to their GPs, Caroline?
Yeah, the referrals, we do occasionally have a self-referral process, but normally they come through education, social care, or the health, or a health professional. It doesn't necessarily have to be the GP, but it can be a health visitor or somebody of that sort. And there is a process for referrals, which is on our website. Incidentally, I just saw flashed up that someone recommended Dave Goulson's book, The Garden Jungle, and I love that book. It's brilliant. So yeah, Dave Goulson does some great books in this field. Not so much on health, but very good on gardening and nature and insects and so on.
Just to add to that, you can self-refer to the local mind organisations across Kent. So if you go onto the various websites, there's a North Kent Mind, a West Kent Mind, the South Kent Mind, an East Kent Mind and a Mid Kent Mind. So just Google those and somewhere there is a mind for you.
5 of them.
5 of them.
Yeah. Brilliant.
No, thank you, Stevie. I knew about West Kent Mind and East Kent Mind, but I wasn't aware of the others, so that's really helpful. Thank you. Okay, we're nearly at the end. I just thought I'd just read out, no doubt other people have seen it in the chat, but one person said, when I was milking cows, we regularly had groups of children from London visit us to watch us milking the cows and to experience the farm. It was lovely to see their reactions as they began to realise where milk came from. It was especially funny when a cow pooed. So our natural environment, our wildlife, not just our wildlife, but our domestic animals can all help us. They can just help us with life. So are there any other questions that anyone would like to put in the chat? Otherwise, we can close our seminar. Nothing's come through immediately. So as I said, we will be putting the webinar on the website once we've chopped it and made sure it's ready to go. But otherwise, I'd like to thank very much indeed Stevie Rice and Caroline Jessel for your presentations. So stimulating, so interesting. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you to everyone for attending. Thank you and good evening.